and I saw this round ball of light. It looked like it was near the ground. Then I was really spooked. And suddenly we both just became terrified and ran out of the room screaming. My PhD was from the University of Missouri College of Veterinary Medicine. I had a postdoc at Cornell University and was a professor at St. Bonaventure University. And before that, I had tried to get into astronomy, and I had worked as a physical scientist in the, I forget what it's called now, the National Aerospace Center, whatever it is. And then I had been a GS-11 at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I'd also worked as an astronomer and had worked for Popular Mechanics as a correspondent. So that's my background. And one reason I got into it was because my sister and I had UFO events since we were young kids. We didn't know what UFOs were when we started. And when we were kids, this thing was in our room. It was summertime and no storm was going on. And I woke up and this thing was flying around the room. And my sister was in a bed on the other side of the room, and I didn't know she was awake. But it flew around, just sort of browsing, and I noticed that although the room was dark, it knew where the furniture was, and avoided it and went around furniture and stuff. And so I thought, this is pretty odd. And then it went up to the ceiling and flew across the ceiling, and it was an attic room, and the walls came together at the top with about 3 feet, and there was a chandelier in the middle. And without feeling its way around, it circled the chandelier. And then it made a spiral under that. And suddenly we both just became terrified and ran out of the room screaming and fell down the stairs. We were so terrified and couldn't get the door open, went shrieking to our parents. And they said it was our imaginations. But if it had just happened to one of us, they would say you were dreaming, but it happened to both of us, and we weren't even talking to each other when it happened. So we knew something real happened. And then we never heard of UFOs. And when we did hear of UFOs, we thought they were like airplanes. So we didn't view that as having anything to do with UFOs for a long time. But then Jenny Randles wrote a book that told about how children that will see things like small UFOs or small orbs, and then later in adult life see UFOs. And that sort of happened to us. And so that got me started. I was always in science, and I never got into UFOs until I was getting close to retirement, because I didn't want, you don't talk about that in scientific positions. So that's how.
Well, tell me about this thing that was in your room. Describe it more completely for me.
Well, it was kind of like, you might call it the original Tic Tac object. It was like sort of like a little cough drop. It was small, about cough drop size, and glowing. And it looked kind of like hot iron or something, like real hot glowing melted iron.
Did it appear metallic, or was it like just a light?
I don't know. If you see hot iron, it looks kind of liquid, and that's what this kind of looked like. But it was definitely a light, and it didn't blink, and that was the color. But I don't know whether it was solid or not.
Was that an isolated experience, or did you and your sister, did you see that ever again?
Well, years later, we both had UFO sightings, and then years later, both together again, we had a very long UFO encounter that lasted for several hours together. Would you be interested in that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Tell me the details of that experience.
Well, at that time, I was working for the DIA, and I had a real high security clearance, one of those SCI ones that they have in the news all the time. And I was working in air order of battle identifying airplanes. And so I should have been pretty up on my identification of aircraft. And I was working in Washington, D.C., and my sister was at Drew University doing postgraduate work. And so we were both on the Eastern Coast, and we decided to go up and have a vacation, see the New England states. And so I picked up a couple of coworkers and drove up to Drew and took pictures of everybody and left them off and picked my sister up. And we continued on to Boston. And we were planning to stay in Boston all night and then go on up and look around. But we got there early. It was still daylight. And so I decided to go up to New Hampshire just because that's where the freeway went. And we drove up there and accidentally, I found out later, in sort of the same area as the hill, Betty and Barney Hill, the end of that. But anyway, then we came back to Boston and we couldn't find a hotel. Everything seemed to be filled up. So we left. And as we were leaving Boston, I think it was on Route 9, we were going to go around the outer belt and look for a place to stay. Well, we started seeing this object, and you could look south and there was an airport, the Norwood Memorial Airport south of us. And you could see airplanes coming in and landing and having their red and green wing lights and landing lights and things. But below the airplanes, there was this blinking object. And it didn't look anything like an airplane. We couldn't figure out what it was. And my sister finally started saying she thought it was a UFO. And I told her she was nuts. And we continued. And we were arguing about it a little bit. But then on the west side of the road, there was a woods. And I saw this round ball of light. It looked like it was near the ground. And it was going through a spectrum of like all shades of red and all shades of blue and all shades of red again. And I couldn't figure out what it was. It had a thing around it, looked like it was rotating. And I looked at it and I couldn't figure out. And then the inside of the car turned green. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. I looked at the thing in the woods and it wasn't green. And I looked around, I didn't see green anyplace except inside our car. And so I couldn't figure out what was going on then. And then the green disappeared and we continued on. And after a while, my sister started yelling at me and saying, stop and pull over. And I still thought she was crazy, but she kept really yelling. So I did. And then I pointed my hand out the window and I was going to tell her, see, nuts, you're not a dingbat or something. It was a helicopter. And so I pointed my hand out the window. And just then I saw a meteor way in the distance. And then this thing came over. And my sister said that at that time that she thought it shone a light in the car. And she said the inside of the car lit up with a funny light, kind of bluish. And I didn't see that, but I was sitting on the window, by the window too. And so this thing came over the road very, very slowly. At that time, it seemed to have, it was sort of submarine shaped. It seemed to have a Tic Tac shaped actually too. And it had what looked like 7 windows, real bright, big, square windows. With real bright light coming out of them. And we sort of discussed whether it was panels or windows, and we thought it was windows. And we'd both seen blimps with lighted windows. This wasn't anything like that. And it had a red light on one end, a green light on the other, were real dim and didn't blink. And it didn't make a sound. And it just floated over us very slowly. and we discussed it. And it had, at that time, we saw 7 windows, and they were blinking in a sequence. And I don't remember the sequence. It was like maybe the first 2 would blink, and then all 7, and then the last 3 would blink twice or something like that. I don't remember the sequence exactly. But anyway, I had changed my mind about that and decided that this wasn't a helicopter. It made no sound, and there were no wings or anything like that, or propellers or anything. And I was in photography at the DIA, and so I thought, boy, I could take a wonderful picture here. And I had a Polaroid camera in my car. I mean, this was way back quite a few years ago, with high-speed film, which was 3000 ASA. And I had to find the film in the camera and then load the camera with the film. And so I was going to take a picture. I was going to take several pictures, and I thought this would be fantastic. This would be a wonderful picture. I get those windows and the object and the freeway and everything. It was dark, but there was a little bit of light and the cars going by and things. And I just thought, well, this is fantastic. And so I got the camera loaded and ready to go. And a truck driver pulled over in front of us and came back and said, "What are you doing?" And this big thing was going over slowly. And I pointed at it, and I didn't say UFO. I just said, like, what kind of airplane is that or something? And he turned around the opposite direction, totally the opposite direction of where it was, looked just in the opposite direction, said, "I don't see anything." Then he turned back to me, and I was creeped out. And then he said the same thing. "What are you doing?" And I pointed again, and my sister was standing right beside me. And again, he just rotated around the exact opposite direction of where it was, looked up and said, "I don't see anything." Then he turned around to me again, and he kind of pointed his head or gave the gesture like he thought I was crazy, and went back to his truck. Well, then, and I thought my sister saw him, but I just found out recently she didn't. But anyway, we were both standing there, and the thing went over to the airport and began to circle it, and it circled sort of in a sequence from north to south. It'd go so fast you couldn't even see it. From south to north, it'd blink twice, and it kept circling that pattern. And so I wanted to get pictures, and I just missed a dream picture because of the truck driver. And so I decided the freeway had traffic, and I was afraid I'd get lens flares. So I walked up to there was a hill on one side, and I was going to climb the hill. And my sister tried to stop me, and I didn't know why she tried to stop me, because I kept telling her to defend the car from the man. But she apparently didn't know the man had been there, which I found out later, recently, I said. But anyway, I climbed up the hill and took some pictures, and it took me a long time to understand them. But eventually I did, and just one of them turned out. And it was complicated, but I figured it out. And then I came back, and the thing was farther. It was circling the airport still. And this was before the internet or anything, so I couldn't get on the internet and find out, about the airplane patterns or anything else. And so anyway, then I decided it had been going south, and I decided it was probably going to go north. And so I was going to go on the freeway to the next interchange and turn around, head north. And so I got on the freeway, and the truck driver went right in behind me. He turned on his bright lights and shone them in my mirror, which the lights are a little higher, and I was just blinded. And so I switched lanes and slowed down and sped up, and he just followed me, and very, very close. And I was kind of terrified because I thought he was going to kill us. And then finally I decided to drive as fast as I could on the left side of the road. And then the next interchange we came to, I'd swerve off real fast and turn around and go the other way. And so I did that, which was very dangerous because somebody had been going faster on the right side of the road. We would have got killed or you have a bad accident. But anyway, then I came back. The thing was still circling the airport. And then but it started going northwest. And I started following that, but I had to zigzag on the roads. And the round ball of light was still there, and the inside of the car turned green again. And then we followed up this real old, miserable gravel road with houses a long ways away where you couldn't turn around. And we couldn't get any closer because it was just going just a little bit faster than the car would go. And so eventually I turned around and we went all the way back to Drew. And Bud Hopkins had asked me if we had missing time. And at that time, I didn't know, but last year, my sister found a letter that I had written it up too right afterwards, but I hadn't put times in. And last year, she found a letter that she'd written to my mother that had the times in. And our sighting had lasted quite a while, several hours. And so it's too late to tell Bud Hopkins because he's dead, but we probably had missing time. And then I stayed in the dorm, and then I went back to Washington, D.C. And in Washington, D.C., that night I had a poltergeist experience. And so then everything went back to normal.
Well, I want to hear about that poltergeist experience, but I have a question about you. You said you got a picture of it and you couldn't figure it out at first, but because it was complicated, but then you did figure out what was in that image. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I actually published it in a scientific journal. At first, it just looked like squiggles, and I couldn't figure it out what on earth it was. And I showed it to a photography expert, and he said that there were two lights, and they were making a trace. It went up and down a little bit, and that was probably because I didn't have a tripod and my hands wouldn't be steady. But then I figured it out that the squiggles were two different lights, and they came on and turned off at different times, and had one of them was steady and one of them increased in probably amplitude or whatever, and then decreased. And so they didn't match each other. First I was afraid they were car headlights, but they weren't because the two just didn't match. And then what happened was I'd only seen one light. At the time I took the picture, the thing was farther away. There was just one blinking light. And so the camera took two blinking lights. And so I figured out from that the camera had picked up light that wasn't in the visible spectrum. And I called Polaroid and they said, yes, it can do that. And I found out the spectrum that it would pick up. And I wrote that up in a scientific journal, the AAAS. And it was accepted. And so it was very complicated and I couldn't figure it out at first, but after a while I did.
Well, it's interesting now. And so the night progresses and you get back to Washington, D.C. and you have a poltergeist experience. Tell me about that.
Well, I got back, it was pretty late. I was waiting to pick up the men I had taken up. And they knew where I was and everything. But for some reason, they couldn't find us, and they were real mad at me the next week. And I couldn't figure out why, because I waited for hours for their call and had people monitor the phones and things. And so I don't know what happened there, but I got back pretty late on account of waiting for them. And then I went to bed, and real soon after I went to bed, I had the lights were turned off, but there was a little bit of light coming into the windows from the street lights. And I heard somebody like walking around my room, but it just like take 3 or 4 steps and stop, and then it'd be someplace else. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And it was like a man with shoes on. And so I tried to feel it when it got near the bed, but I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't see anything. And then, so I was pretty scared. Then I went to sleep and the alarm went off and I woke up and I thought it was morning and I got up and started making breakfast and I realized it was dark and I looked at the clock and it was 1:30. And so then I was really spooked and I put a chair against the door, not that it did any good because something was seemed to be in the place instead of outside. But anyway, my alarm clock had the little thing you twist was broken and I couldn't set it except with pliers. And if I tried to set it by hand, I couldn't get it even close, but just very approximate. But the alarm went off that night at 1:30, 2:30, 3:30, 4:30, and I think 5:30. And I couldn't figure out why each time it went off, each time I was terrified, and each time I went back to sleep. And then finally in the morning, I had this real high security clearance and a high DIA position. And I was afraid I'd gone crazy. I didn't know anything about poltergeists then. I didn't know what was going on. And I was sitting on the bed thinking, how to disguise insanity if I was insane at work. And then for some reason, my toothbrush just flung across the room from behind me and hit the wall. And I didn't know what happened there. And then everything went back to normal, fortunately. And I wasn't crazy and went to work and had a normal day of work and came back home and wrote everything up. So.
Wow. So you have had a lifetime of some rather unusual experience, some involving UFOs, some poltergeists, some unidentified objects in your rooms.
Uh-huh. And
wow.
I had witnesses for nearly all of them too.
Yeah, and that's rare. That's very interesting. So what have you learned since those early days with those experiences about UFOs in general?
I haven't learned much. I mean, everybody says, well, you've been studying this for years. You should know something. I still don't know what they are or what they're doing or anything else. So I hate to say this, but I think I would just suspect that we're at a fairly low level and they're at a much higher level and we don't understand them would be all I can suspect.
So tell me about the book you've written. I know you've written several books, but what is this book, the title of the book, and kind of give us an idea of what it's about?
The last one I wrote with Philip Mantle was Beyond Reasonable Doubt. And this was about an abduction. And usually abductions take place like out in the boondocks someplace with one person and no witnesses, nobody around. There's nothing to say that anything happened. Well, this was different because this happened to two witnesses. And it also happened in a place that was kind of public. And there were other witnesses that saw the objects, quite a few actually. And so this was quite a bit different. We called it Beyond Reasonable Doubt because it might be enough information to, in a court case, if it's beyond reasonable doubt, there's a finding that it's true. I mean, that's, finding in favor of whatever. And in this case, although most abductions are way nothing you could prove, this was sort of like be proof in a court of law because there were other witnesses. And this was the Pascagoula, October the 11th abduction. And it was two men, Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker. Hickson was an older man. He'd been in the Army and been in life and death situations and things like that. Calvin was a young kid. He was 18 and he was on his first day of work too. And so they had been to their day of work and decided to go fishing. And this was down in Pascagoula, Mississippi, by the river and by the Gulf of Mexico. And what people do there with all that water, they boat and swim and all that kind of thing. And so these people decided to go fishing after the day of work. So they went in a couple places, couldn't find anything. And then the young man had a new car, and he was a little bit nervous about that. And the older man wanted to go to this place that he thought there was good fishing. But they had to go to this place where there was a sign that said no trespassing, and they had to walk through weeds a long time and get to the pier. And the younger man wasn't thrilled about that. But they went and they started fishing. Well, then they saw a blue light, and the younger man thought, oh no, that's the police. And he told the older man that he could go to jail because it was his idea to go to this place. And so the older man, they both saw this light, and then it was a lot worse than the police. It was a UFO, and it was just kind of levitating over to him. And it didn't land, it was just hovered or levitated. And it had a real bright light. And these three things came out of it. And two of them grabbed the older man, one grabbed the younger man, and levitated him in the object and split them so that they were in different rooms, or whatever you call it. And the inside of it was so bright they could just barely see anything, and couldn't see features or anything. The light just seemed to be there, like it came from the walls or something. It was real bright. And with the older man, something came out of the wall that looked like an eye, and it seemed to rotate around him and scan him. With the younger man, something came out of the ceiling or the wall, and also it was about the size of a deck of cards. They said back then. Today it's about the size of the iPhone or something, and it went around him and seemed to scan him. And then they both thought they might have been on board for maybe 15 minutes or half an hour. They weren't sure. And then the things placed them back on the deck. And they were both just absolutely terrified because they thought, that they were being captured, that they could get killed, they could get put in a zoo or whatever. And so anyway, then they sort of started coming to, and the thing left. And the younger man was just standing there with his arms out. And the older man fell down, and finally he got up, and then he started trying to get the younger man awake. And so at that point, they had just been through all kinds of stress that you couldn't imagine. And added to their stress, they at first said, well, we won't tell anybody about this, because obviously if they told somebody, everybody'd call them crazy, which is stressful too. And so anyway, then the older man, he had been through life and death situations, and he thought he could hold up to being harassed. The younger man had his whole life ahead of him. He was engaged and everything else, and he didn't want to be, go through life with people pointing to his head and calling him crazy. So he didn't want to say anything, but finally the older man decided, yes, he was going to say something because it could happen to somebody else. It could be the part of an invasion. It's something the public should know. And so they stopped at, first of all, a newspaper, and the newspaper was closed. Then they stopped at Kessler Air Force Base. And Kessler told them that they had stopped studying UFOs. They probably, according to the Blue Book, UFOs didn't exist and all that. And so they said, don't worry, don't think about it. And so they told him to contact the local authorities. So they contacted the police, and the police came out, and they just did an excellent investigation, because they, first of all, split them and interviewed them separately. Then they put them together and interviewed them together. Then the interviewer left the room, and they didn't tell anybody they didn't tell them what was going on, but they had a hidden tape recorder. And that was because the police didn't want to be made fun of. I mean, if they were hoaxing, well, it looked to make the police look pretty stupid if they believed them. So they wanted to find out what the people would say if they didn't know anybody was there. And they expected to be laughing and saying, well, we put one over on them and everything. Well, then they got the tape, and it turned out that the two men were just out of their minds in fear that they had been through a horrible, horrible experience. And they were talking about the experience of being grabbed and things like that. And this was called a secret tape, and there's still a recording of that. So that really showed that they believed that this happened, that they were sincere. And that was a real good investigation, and probably the best investigation that's ever been done of an abduction type thing, because they found out immediately afterwards that these two people were sincere. And then also there were two witnesses here, and they both consciously remembered everything immediately. So this was very unusual for a abduction investigation.
What motivated you to write about this?
Well, what motivated my co-author, Philip Mantle, was that he had started a publishing business, and he had published a book by the older man. And he wanted to find the younger man. And he looked and looked, and finally, through several people, he found him. And the older man had talked about it and been on TV shows and like maybe, I forget, the Tonight Show and all kinds of things. The younger man didn't want to say anything about it ever. And he just shut up and said, I fainted and I don't remember. For all those years, around 50 years, he didn't talk about it. And, they say that people who have these sightings or say they're abducted are hoaxers who want attention and things. Well, the younger man certainly didn't want any attention. He didn't want anybody to know who he was, and hid it for his whole life. And so anyway, the publisher published the book of the older man. He wanted to find the younger man. And it took him quite a bit of effort, but he found him. And at that point, the younger man, his wife was saying that he ought to come out of his shell and say something, because he hadn't said anything about it for his whole life. I mean, for like about 48 years or something, he just hadn't said anything about it, and not even to her. And she thought it was eating away on him, and that he ought to talk about it. And then the publisher called, and the publisher sort of urged him that it might be well to talk about it. And finally, between the wife and the publisher and everybody, he decided to write a book, and he wrote 2 books, and they were published by the publisher. And the publisher wanted to keep on investigating. Well, and the publisher's in the UK, and they have an accent over there. And Calvin Parker was in Mississippi, where they also have an accent. And the other, Charlie, had died several years ago. And the publisher wanted somebody to interview them in the United States, because it was confusing with the time change and the accents and everything. So he asked me to. And I had something involved with that happening to me way, way back when it happened, when the abduction happened. It wasn't something I paid attention to, but at that time, my mother had called and asked me if I heard a noise. And she was in Ohio and I was in Missouri, which was 600 miles away. And I thought she had just flipped her wig or something, and told her she was crazy. And she kept asking, did you hear that sound? I kept saying no. And then she was a real skeptic too. Several days later, she called and said there was this real big flap there in Ohio where she was, and that people were just seeing UFOs all over the place. and one of them chased one of her friend's cars, and the governor of the state had seen one, and people were staying in at night, and it sounded like a war zone. Well, and I found out later that that call was the same time as the abduction took place, but I didn't know that then. Several years later, I was working at Ohio State University, and the library had real actual newspapers instead of all those microfilm you go crazy looking at. And one day, just on impulse, I decided to go in and see if I could find the date of that phone call about the sound. And I knew, that there had been a big flap too. But I just walked in the newsroom, and there were these millions and millions of papers all over. And I thought, I'll never find this. And I didn't remember the date. And so I just made a guess at the date, that it was the middle of October in 73. And that was a wild guess. And I thought, well, I'll never find it, and I'll just look at a few papers and quit. Well, I looked at a few papers, and I actually found it. A little tiny note on one that said this strange sound. And so I think it was because my mother had been so weird about calling me. And I wondered what was wrong with her. And so I started trying to find out what the sound was. And it was a huge sound. It covered about 1/4 of the country, and nobody had any explanation for it at all. And so anyway, I did some research, and I submitted to a scientific journal, and the state seismologist of Ohio got interested and contacted me and helped me look at seismographs and get seismograph printings and things. And so I did that, and I actually got it published in a scientific journal. And so anyway, that had happened to me way back, but that sound I heard had been that sound my mother heard, and I got the phone call, had been just about exactly the same time as their abduction. At that time, I paid no attention to the abduction at all. But when Philip Mantle contacted me about interviewing people, I was quite interested, because having the previous experience of something strange happening to me at the same time as the abduction. So I was interested, and that's why I got into it. And then we kept finding more and more witnesses, and just, putting the stuff together. And finally, we had so much material, we decided to write a book about it. And that's how our book came about.
What were some of the confirming pieces of information that you found that contributed to the making of the title of this and the validity of this abduction?
Well, one thing valid would be the sound. And I wrote another book about that, which was before this, but I think it would stand up to scientific scrutiny, because, I don't know what it had to do with the abduction, but it was the same time, and it was not in the same area, but there was just a big flap all over, so it could have been connected some way. It was like a mystery and UFO thing. But Calvin had been interviewed, and that was put on YouTube. And some woman had written in and said, well, she knew it was true because her parents had seen it. And this was a strange thing. And so Philip, who just is an amazing person at finding things and getting the data together and everything else, contacted her and found out who her parents were, and talked a little bit to her parents, and then gave the information to me to interview him. And this was my first interview for him. And it was this couple that had been parked on the other side of the river from the abduction. And they had seen something going on then, but they didn't know what was going on until the next day when it came out about the abduction. But the man was going out with his supervisor on a boat to supply oil rigs or something. His supervisor was late. This was before cell phones or anything. And so they were sitting on the bank with the pier going out, and the ship was at the end of the pier, and waiting for the supervisor to show up. Well, when I first called him, I first talked to the husband, who was a skeptic, and he said something about a big splash, and he thought it was a blimp or something, and handed the phone over to his wife. Well, his wife said they were sitting in the car, and he went to sleep, and she saw this airplane, and it just seemed to not go anyplace. It just seemed to be cruising around, and there wasn't any airfield or anything else where it was. It would have been on the side where the abduction took place, and she couldn't figure out what it was doing, and she kept thinking, well, the pilot's lost, he's looking for something, what's he doing? And she didn't know. She thought it was an airplane. And so then he decided to put his clothes in the ship, and it was around 9 o'clock. And so they were walking down the pier to the ship, and he was ahead of her. And she said that something just flopped up on the pier right in front of her, right practically where she was, and then went back down. It looked like a man. And then she thought, he'll have to come out and breathe. And nothing came back up. And she was just really, really emotional about this, but she didn't know why she was emotional. And then they went on down to the ship, and then somehow 3 hours seemed to pass. And she came back about 12 o'clock, and she was really terrified and ran back and jumped in the car. And so we talked about this for about 2 years, talked and wrote. And she, I could see she was just emotional, just real tight about this thing that came up. But she didn't have any idea why she was so emotional. And then, unfortunately, her husband became ill and died later. But he was in the hospital, and just before they put him on a ventilator, he couldn't talk after that. But just before that, he told her that they had been abducted. And this was news to her because he had always been a skeptic. And apparently he had had some kind of relationship with these aliens, or whatever you call them, for a long time. And sort of knew him or something. And he had asked them to protect her and not hurt her for whatever they were doing. And so she was pretty surprised at that, because he'd been a skeptic and hadn't told her anything about this. And then later, well, they filmed him talking right before he went into the ventilator, and then he died. And they also called Philip Mantle, and he talked to him and told him that. So they had, some verification that he said that. And so anyway, it turned out that these two people on the other side of the river thought they had been abducted too. And so that we found out a whole lot of other people that saw things the same night.
And apparently multiple abductions potentially that same time frame.
Yeah, that was really strange, because it's probably the first time anything like that had been reported, multiple possible abduction by possibly the same object at the same time, which I don't think it's ever been reported before.
Exactly. A question about when you and your sister had the potential missing time framework. Have you ever gone under hypnosis or done any investigation about that?
Well, I couldn't. When Bud Hopkins was alive, he asked me about that, and I couldn't tell him anything because I had written everything up the next day after it happened, but I hadn't put any times in. And he hypnotized me and tried for a long time. And I didn't hypnotize at all. And then I tried a couple of other doctors, and I just don't hypnotize. I mean, nothing happens to me. I don't go into a trance or anything hypnotize. So it didn't do me any good whatsoever. But then I found my sister's letter. She found it last year, and she had actually written down the times and everything. And so we both thought maybe we saw the UFO for about, you know, an hour or two. And we wondered why we got back at back to the I mean, we first got to Boston about 9 and ran up the freeway and back and left at about maybe 10 or 11, somewhere around there. And we thought we saw the UFO for about an hour. And it takes about 3 hours to get from Boston to New York. And that was in the middle of the night with no traffic and, you know, going fairly fast. So we should have got back about 3. And I thought there's maybe missing time, but I didn't know. But then she had, in her letters, she had everything written down according to the time. And it turned out we had, our UFO thing had lasted about 4.5 hours, which we didn't, you know, it only seemed like an hour or less. And so we probably had missing time. But I'm finding out nothing because neither one of us remember abduction. I don't hypnotize at all. And my sister thinks hypnosis is kind of, you know, that maybe you can just say anything under hypnosis, and she's suspicious of that and not too interested. So we're not gaining any information at all, although we may have missing time.
For sure. Well, since you've had experiences since a child, and what age were you when this thing came into your room from the ceiling and the wall?
Well, my sister said she wasn't in school at the time, and I don't remember whether I was or not. So I would say maybe I was 6 and maybe she was 4. We were pretty young, but we both definitely remembered it.
Since
And
you've had experiences all of your life, and these types of experiences do tend to run throughout a lifetime for a lot of people, have you found any similarities in other respects between you, your sister, and other people that have had lifelong experiences?
well, I think we're real unique because this pattern of seeing an object when you're a small object when you're small and then larger objects when you're older happens to one person. In our case, it happened to 2 people, both at once. I mean, we saw the thing when we were kids and then when we were older. And so we were pretty unique there because we could both say, well, you know, when we were kids, if they said you were dreaming, which they would say to one kid, well, we weren't dreaming because we both saw the same thing. But even with that, it was like there was some kind of mind control or something because we'd both just gone up and gone to sleep and it was a normal night. And we both woke up and this thing was in the room. And there's reasons how I know it was a clear night. It wasn't like a lightning ball, but we didn't know how the thing got in the room. And then we watched it and we weren't talking to each other. So we weren't influencing each other, but then we both just became absolutely terrified at the same time too, and ran out of the room. So it was like it was some kind of mind control that suddenly we both woke up at the same time and became terrified at the same time. And it was just a little thing, but it seemed to have some kind of influence over our minds. And so that's pretty creepy.
It really is. I mean, that would kind of scare you as a child. I'm pretty sure. Going back to your experience on the road, where the truck driver was there. Now, was there some explanation as to why your sister did not see him or acknowledge him? And I mean, a truck parked and a guy standing there would be a rather obvious thing.
Well, that's what I thought. In all these years, I thought she knew the truck driver was there, although I didn't know for sure because when I ran up the hill, she tried to stop me, and I kept telling her, you have to protect the car from the truck driver. And she didn't seem to know what I was talking about, but I just assumed she knew he was there. And then after she found this letter last year, I asked her, and she said, no, she didn't know the truck driver was there. I mean, she knew later when it was chasing us down the road, it was there. But when I talked to him, she didn't know he was there. And I just found that out a year ago. And so it was like something was affecting our minds there. Like maybe they deleted her memory of talking to him, or they put something in my mind or something, because she didn't know he was there, and I was talking to him, but he just looked like a normal person, talked like a normal person, but he didn't act like a normal person at all.
Have you ever investigated, what kind of truck he was in, or um, what or who he might have been?
No, because like this was way back before the internet and all that, and she was at New York, and I was in Washington D.C. Plus, I was working for the DIA, and I was about the only female in the whole place where I worked, and I didn't want to say anything about that. I did go to a payphone and look up UFOs in the phone directory, and it was NICAP, and I reported it, but I didn't give my name or address or anything like that, so it wouldn't have been a formal report. But I did write everything down and tend to, that sometime in the future I would say something, but I had that real high security clearance, and you didn't go around saying, "Oh, I see UFOs" back then.
Can you
So I
describe what that man looked like? What did what he had on, dressed like, or just what did he look like?
well, at the time, um, it was dark, and he just looked like a normal man. It was, we were in Boston, and he didn't have any accent or anything, and I couldn't really see him because it was dark. But he just looked like a normal man, and I didn't pay any attention to the truck because I didn't know it was going to chase us later. So there was really no way to do anything. If it happened now, I'd be on the internet and contact the airport and everything I possibly could. But back then, it was just totally different, and you couldn't do anything.
No, and probably didn't even suspect anything at the time as to what he was doing there.
Well, there was a lot of traffic, not a lot of traffic, that time of night, but some traffic. And I remember when the thing was going over the road, I noticed his truck right under it. And then it came and parked, and he came up and talked to me. And he was the only traffic that I noticed. And his truck was right under it. And that's why I couldn't understand why he was asking me, "What are you doing?" Because he should have seen it. And that just made no sense at all. And then I pointed at it, and he turned around, looked the other direction twice, and said, "I don't see anything." It was like he was giving me signals that I was crazy or something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very odd thing. And obviously, I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it probably was intended to stop you from getting a picture or whatever he was trying to do.
Yeah. You read all these things about abductions, and maybe we had an abduction of some type there. But it was like he deliberately, well, I mean, like if you point at something, somebody will look in the direction you point, and even a dog will. But I pointed, and he turned around twice, looked in the other direction, and then told me, "I don't see anything," which, was kind of like, and then at the end, he gave some motion. I don't know if he pointed his head or something, like he was telling me I was crazy. Well, my sister was seeing the same thing I saw, so I didn't think I was crazy. But it was like he was telling me I was crazy and it didn't exist. I mean, that was just the feeling I got from the way he acted.
Right. Yeah. Well, and these were the isolated experiences, one as a child and then this one just outside of Boston. Those were the only two experiences you remember having in your lifetime?
No, we both had separate experiences too.
Tell me about some of those.
Well, also when I was a kid, I was a little older, and I'd heard of UFOs at the time, but I was, it was, we were poor, and it was a farm, and I was outside sleeping on a rock, and this this glowing orange thing came over, and it looked about the same apparent size as an airplane, and it came from the north. I just woke up, and this thing was coming from the north. And when it got directly overhead, all the dogs in the neighborhood, and it was a farm neighborhood, and I knew the neighbors and knew their dogs, started barking. And our dog, who was locked in the kitchen and couldn't see anything, began to jump and bark and everything. And move around and everything. And then it was right, that was when it was right overhead, and then it went on and I guess went behind the trees or something. But for some reason, I was just absolutely terrified. I was so terrified you couldn't believe it. And I didn't say anything to my parents because they would tell me I was lying. So I just laid there in terror until the morning came. And then I had several others. One time I worked at Ohio State later, and I was just going through my normal life. I paid no attention to UFOs or anything. Well, for some reason, I became just absolutely terrified of UFOs. I just woke up one morning. I was terrified of UFOs. I was so scared I didn't want to go out of the house or anything else. But I went to work every day and came home and had this terror, and I couldn't figure out why. And so I decided to report that we'd had UFO sightings. And so I contacted the Center for UFO Studies, which is Dr. Hynek's outfit, and they sent me a report form. And that day at work at noon, I was going to start filling it out. And for some reason, I went to the end of the building, was walking down the stairs. I was going someplace, I don't remember where. I looked up and I saw this thing, and I couldn't figure out what on earth it was. It was like, it had kind of smoke, and it was like beams, like a building with erector beams or something up in the sky, and it sort of had a bright light. And I had no idea what it was. And there was another person I knew that was there, and I asked her what it was, and she didn't know. And so we went to the department office, and it was over. It had been there. It was over. Ohio State University is directly west of the airport, and then Battelle Memorial Institute is on the other side. Well, it was headed kind of toward, should have been within the radar of the airport. And a number of people in the office saw it too, and nobody could figure out what it was. And while it was in sight, I called a person I knew at Battelle and asked him, and he couldn't see it. He went up to the top of the roof, and then he called Port Columbus, the airport, and now it's John Glenn Airport. But anyway, they couldn't see anything or get anything on radar, which is funny because there were 4 or 5 people in the office room watching it. And he said, well, nobody saw anything. And so anyway, the thing lasted for about 20 minutes or something, the sighting. And I told everybody I'd be confidential because there were 3 professors, and everybody else now was a professor that I talked to. So they were a well-qualified group of people. But I got descriptions and written descriptions and drawings from 5 different people about it. But at that time, I wasn't a UFO investigator, and I didn't know too much about it. And I didn't do, I got the descriptions and everything. But years later, that thing at O'Hare Airport happened, of people seeing an object over O'Hare, and that made the news. But like, I didn't report anything because I told these other people I wouldn't say anything, although I sent the description into the Center for UFO Studies office.
Yes. Do you have anything else you'd like to share?
Well, our book is we went to a lot of work at it. It's on Amazon.com, and there's a whole lot of witnesses besides the one I talked about. And it's different from most abduction types because there are a lot of people that saw something at the same time. And so it sort of adds to the credibility of possible abductions.